Welcome to Betrayal Trauma Recovery, BTR.org. I'm Anne. I'm sure you remember what it was like when you were searching for help, maybe for your husband, hoping to find the right program or therapist. That's why I started podcasting. I supported my husband through 7 years of pornography addiction recovery, and not one therapist during that time told me I was experiencing emotional and psychological abuse and sexual coercion. I didn't want any other woman on the planet to be in the dark. If you're like the majority of my listeners, you're experiencing the type of abuse that's invisible and difficult to wrap your head around. Your husband is using porn or having affairs or lying to you, and you're getting the same bad advice about how to improve communication or your relationship. If you need support from women who totally understand, check out our daily group session schedule at btr.org/group. We'd love to see you in a session today. One simple, anonymous way to help spread the word is to click, follow, or subscribe to the Betrayal Trauma Recovery podcast on your favorite podcasting app. While you're there, every 5-star rating helps make this podcast more visible and will help save other women from getting the wrong kind of help, like a couple program that will make this type of abuse worse. For those of you who follow or subscribe to this podcast, thank you so much. Your support means so much to me. I recorded this interview in 2019 at a very intense time during my ex-husband's post-separation abuse. I interviewed Dave Cawley, host of the Cold podcast, and I want to give a shout out. He was so willing to listen to me back in 2019. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for using that interview as a way to learn more about my story and other victims. I genuinely felt like he cared about me personally and that he cared for all victims. So a thank you to Dave Cawley and all men who are standing up for abuse victims. I'm really excited to have Dave Cawley with us today. Dave is a graduate of the University of Utah's Journalism School and then went to work as a field reporter in Salt Lake City. Dave joined KSL, and then in 2018, he moved into a new role as executive producer of digital content. On December 14th, 2018, KSL and Dave launched the podcast series Cold. The first season focused on the unsolved disappearance of Susan Powell. That story was close to Dave because he reported on Susan's suspected murder from the beginning in December 2009 and continues to dig for new details. Cold reached #1 on the Apple Podcast chart on the day of its release. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Anne. I really appreciate being on.
The story of Susan Powell broke the year after I was married. I got married in 2008. And so in 2009, when Susan first went missing, I was following the story closely. I had a sense at that time that something was wrong in my own marriage. I wouldn't say at the time that I could comprehend what was happening or even verbalize that my husband was abusive, but something about Susan's story was calling to me. On the day that Josh murdered his sons and proved himself a murderer, I was at a family dinner with my parents and my siblings and also my husband. I said out loud, "If anything happens to me, he killed me." I wanted to make sure that he heard me say that to everyone because I thought that would help keep me safe. 6 years later, in 2015, he was arrested for domestic violence, and that is what helped me understand what was happening. From your research of Susan Powell, can you talk about how she felt at the beginning of her relationship?
Yeah, I can speak specifically to the circumstances of Josh and Susan's marriage because I had a somewhat unique opportunity to research and study those. Certainly, I don't know the totality of Susan's mind at any given point in time. All I can go on are the clues that she left us and what she wrote in her journal, what she wrote to her friends in emails, messages, things like that, that we drew in to use for the Cold podcast. But I will say, Susan and Josh met when Susan was just barely out of high school. She was very young. And if you look at Susan at that time, she was a great student. She was very hardworking, going to cosmetology school, easily, in my opinion, could have walked into any of the colleges around Washington where she was living at the time. But Josh, very quickly after they started dating, isolated her. And he made her life all about him and their relationship. And he did it very subtly. He used kind of the creation almost of a mythology for their relationship, that this was a very almost fated kind of thing, that they met and fell in love and they're so about one another, when in reality, from I think an objective point of view, you can look and say, well, it was all about how she was serving him, not how he was serving her. He was not doing things in their relationship that were advancing her best interests. He wasn't going out of his way to do things to make her happy. But because of her age and because of, I think, some of her experience dating as a teenager, when she met Josh and he talked the big talk, she kind of fell into the idea of being in love and being in this relationship. They get married very quickly. So within 6 months of beginning to date, they're married. And it's pretty clear from the get-go that things are not good in their relationship because Josh can't keep a job. And every time he loses a job, it's the fault of the employer. It's never his fault. Something is always keeping him down. And so Susan, from the beginning, has to work multiple jobs to try to make ends meet, help Josh get in a better place where he'll be able to hold a job. And they have to move in with family several times, which is not a good situation, as we later learned that her father-in-law is a very unsavory individual, to put it mildly. Then it gets more complicated when children enter the mix. Josh and Susan move away from Washington in part to get away from Josh's dad and some of the bad things and make a fresh start. So Susan at that point, in my opinion, still doesn't see what the origin of the problems are and thinks, hey, if we just get away from Washington, if we get to Utah and we get away from the complicated family dynamics, then Josh and we can make it work. No sooner do they get here than the same dynamic, right? Susan's breadwinning. She is the one who's able to hold a job, but they conceive their first child. And that is really when Susan, I think, starts to begin to see the problems because Josh, as a father, is not helpful. That is in 2005. And then it's really a downhill slide from there for a couple of years. After they have their second child, Braden, Josh really disconnects and the conflict comes out into the open. Josh has been very dismissive of Susan for many years at this point, but once she starts sticking up for herself, she has things that matter to her, that are of value to her in her life, her religion, her standards, and Josh is unwilling to not only practice those himself, but to allow her to practice her own religion, do things like pay her tithing, attend church with her, things like that. And he's also actively undercutting her to the children, talking about how bad it is that mom goes to church and how they don't need to go to church with mom and don't listen to stuff that mom says, which I think any rational person in a marriage would say that is not an okay dynamic. That is when I think Susan starts recognizing that things are really not good. She starts dropping hints to friends that she does feel like she's in danger. But then when other people tell her, hey, you're in a bad situation, you need to get out of here, she will justify why she's kind of staying in.
Well, having been in that situation myself, it's really a situation where you have two bad options. Staying in the marriage is bad, and divorce is also going to be bad. You're trying to figure out which bad scenario is sort of the least bad one. I was really struck in the podcast. Susan did what she was supposed to do as a victim of abuse. She reached out for help, but was told, at least by Clergy, that if you both work on your issues, this can be worked out. Since we have over 150,000 women in our community, I hear women report this all the time. That instead of recognizing the abuse, they're told to go to couple therapy. Can you talk more about the details of what happened when Susan went for help?
That's tough. Let me speak to some of the circumstances with Josh and Susan in counseling, and we'll get there. Because conversations with Clergy are confidential, we're pretty limited in knowing exactly what kind of advice Josh and Susan received. But Susan did write in a couple of places about going to see her bishop, both with Josh and on her own. You can imagine this is a marriage that's at a very low point. They're at each other's throats. And yeah, Susan is argumentative. I mean, she's not one to passively just go with the flow. So when she's unhappy, she's venting about it. Josh points at her as she's the one who's causing all this conflict.
What she's complaining about, and I have that in air quotes, is his abuse.
Right.
Right.
But she's not identified it as such at this point, right?
He's basically saying, I'm mad at her for being mad at me about my abuse.
Right. In so many words, yeah.
Yeah.
Every indication I have is that the members of Clergy that they spoke to said, we are not qualified to be your marriage counselor, so let's connect you with services. So that's how Susan originally gets involved with marriage counseling. This is in 2008, and Josh refuses to go. And the counselor that she was talking to in 2008 did identify and say, you are being abused.
Oh, okay.
And this is when Susan first understood that, because her dad was in town and actually went to the session with her. Chuck Cox, Susan's dad, talks about how afterwards she turned to him and said, do you think that's true? Am I really being abused? And her dad's going, yes. I think too, and what happens is, specifically in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you have lay clergy. And oftentimes, especially at the local level, these people are your neighbors. It can feel very close, I think, even for some of those members of clergy, to be really in the business of the personal lives of their neighbors. And that's uncomfortable. And I don't want to say that there's not accountability in the same way there would be with maybe a professional clergy, but it's a little different in that religious community just because of the way those relationships exist, I think, between sometimes the people who are approaching, a bishop or a stake president or something like that, as opposed to other faiths.
Yeah, and a lot of times clergy, rather than telling the victim, this is an abuse situation, you need to get to safety, they focus on trying to help him reactivate someone into the church or repent, but they don't realize that's keeping a victim in proximity to the abuse. I was really surprised listening to the Cold podcast, how pornography played such a large role in developing Josh Powell's character. Can you talk about the role that pornography played in Josh Powell's abuse before the murder?
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic for discussion because we have a pretty good record thanks to the divorce filings for Josh's parents going back into the mid-90s. So Josh is a teenager and his mom divorces his dad, in part because Josh's dad was doing a lot of things that were not good. There's some pretty good indication in those filings that he was introducing his kids to pornography when they were young, both sons and daughters. So because of that, we know that Josh was exposed to pornography at an early age. We know that Josh was actually, by his own disclosure later in life to a psychologist, he was arrested at one point for stealing pornographic magazines out of a convenience store. So you see early on that this is part of his life. It's not until after Susan disappears and police seize computers out of their home and those computers are scoured for evidence that we see what happened in the meantime after he and Susan were married, because they locate a number of very concerning images on Josh's computer that had been, for the most part, deleted. So they were in what's called free space. But Josh was regularly viewing pornography on the computer. And Susan talked a lot to her friends in messages and things that Josh was very protective of his computers. She was not allowed to use his computer except to do his chores, scanning his papers and receipts and things. If she wanted to get on the internet and Facebook and things like that, he would not allow her to do that on his computer. She had to have her own computer, which he was unwilling to pay for. So that really protective behavior, I think, personally speaks to Josh knowing that there's material on this computer that he does not want her to find. I know there are some people in law enforcement who believe that the catalyst for Susan's disappearance and murder may very well have been her locating something like that and calling Josh's attention to it and saying, this is a step too far, we're done. That's purely speculation, but I think you see that Josh's viewing of pornography played a role, especially because Susan writes a lot about how he wouldn't touch her. He wouldn't show the normal types of affection that you would expect in a relationship like that. He would not hold her hand. He wouldn't kiss her. When they were physically intimate, which was very rarely, he did not view it as something that was beautiful and shared. It was very clinical. I'm trying not to be too graphic here. I want to be careful to protect Susan's privacy. When they had sex, it was not something that was a beautiful and affirming experience for Susan. It was almost, I think, traumatic in itself because of the way he insisted on it being very quick and clean and then over.
Women in our community assume that their husbands are not viewing pornography because they're attending the temple or going to church, because they're under the impression that their relationship is a certain way and they're not being given all the information that they need to make a decision.
Interesting.
So that form of sexual coercion is, I would say, the most common, but it's still sexual coercion. I don't think porn users understand that that in and of itself is a form of sexual abuse. Just thinking about Susan, how would she feel about this? Didn't enter Josh's mind.
No.
He wasn't concerned about Susan at all.
Not in the least. Yeah. Continuing through their marriage, Josh and Susan moved from Washington to Utah to get away from Steve Powell. But Steve Powell continues to groom his son well into adulthood through these long phone conversations. Steve Powell was dysfunctional in his views on sex and intimacy. He wrote more than 2,000 pages of very pornographic journals detailing his desire for his daughter-in-law, Susan. Mm-hmm. And so he is interested in poisoning his son's marriage on the belief that it will allow him to spark his relationship with Susan, which was never going to happen.
Right.
But because of that, Josh is being fed this constant stream of negativity. If you look at some of Josh's writings, going back even into his teenage years, he struggled even dating before he met Susan with being close. Even just being in physical proximity to a girl or a woman made him uncomfortable. And when he takes that dysfunction into his marriage with Susan, it's Susan's fault because he tells his dad, Susan wants it all the time. By the time their marriage really bottoms out, they are maybe having sex a couple of times a year, if that. Mm-hmm. And so you can imagine Susan feels as a 27-year-old woman, 28-year-old woman, very unfulfilled by a husband who will show her no care in day-to-day life, no care in the bedroom, seems to be repulsed by just the very thought of giving her a kiss or holding her hand. And going back to your earlier point about not recognizing it as abuse, yeah, in our society, abuse carries a lot of connotation. We expect it to be hitting, to be shouting, slamming of doors. Well, I think it's arguable that if you are in a relationship with somebody and you were withholding and playing these kinds of mind games, that is a form of abuse. And unless we can call it such, we can't really address it.
Yeah. Right before my ex's arrest, he started telling me that I was unattractive and that he never thought I was attractive and that he hated me. I was like, whoa. And he would say, I don't love you, but I love the kid. So finally I was like, well, then you should leave.
Yeah.
Right. And then he wouldn't leave. And I was like, okay, this is weird. You think I'm ugly. You don't want to have sex with me and you hate me, but you won't leave? It was so nonsensical. It was totally insane. All right. So we've talked about the psychological abuse that Susan endured. We've talked about how she didn't recognize it. I want to talk about Josh's behavior after the murder. It's similar to many abusers after divorce. They blame their situation on their victim. They continue to lie and hide and manipulate people. And in Josh's case, he had this huge crime and all these people looking at him and reporters trying to investigate. In my case, nobody's been trying to investigate, or he's still an attorney and he's still doing his job and he's still lying about me. So his current congregation thinks that he's this amazing saint and that his crazy ex-wife has done him wrong, and they feel so bad that he's this victim. So even in this case with Josh Powell, where there's a murder and someone is missing and all these police are investigating and you've got all these reporters, and still Josh is walking around. He wasn't immediately struck by lightning or hit by a bus or put in jail. He's got his kids. He's still functioning, sort of. I mean, he's not functioning super well, obviously, but he's still free. Why do you think society is so bad at holding these guys accountable?
I think in a legal sense, and especially in the United States here, we have this concept of innocent until proven guilty. And that is very important to remember when we're talking about someone being accused of something criminally. But a marriage is a civil contract. It's not criminal. So you are married to somebody who is abusing you, and you seek a divorce, and through the divorce, the mind games that very manipulative men in particular can work that system to their advantage or to try to hurt or undercut their former spouse, it doesn't rise to that criminal level. And I think a lot of people in broader society don't want to feel like they are passing a judgment on somebody without proof or evidence. Mm-hmm. And the very nature of this kind of abuse, that manipulation, that financial control, that emotional abuse, is that there is not a trail of evidence. And even if you were able to take it to a police officer or, a prosecutor, they would say, well, what is the crime? There's nothing in criminal statute that it violates. So that person then is able to go back into society and say, well, look, I'm a good guy. I didn't do anything wrong.
I'm the victim. My ex says she kicked me out of the house for no reason, and then she wouldn't talk to me. He doesn't say because I sprained her fingers and I had a no contact order from the courts. He doesn't tell people that part.
Right. We need to, in a cultural sense, in the broadest way possible, confront our own perceptions on abuse and start retraining ourselves. Me telling the Susan Powell story resulted in more people than I can even tell you reaching out to share their own personal experiences. Even talking to you here, Anne, about your relationship, I think is in a similar vein. A lot of women are dealing with this right now and have not ever found somebody who they felt safe being very candid with about what they've gone through. And I think a lot of us hold these personal experiences close. We don't share them. There's shame that's attached to it. There's a fear of not being believed. What I personally learned was that when people are willing to share those stories with me, when women come forward and say, hey, your podcast sounded like my life, the most important thing I can do is express belief and empathy and say, I'm so very grateful that you're safe. I'm sorry you have gone through or are going through this horrible circumstance. I believe you. And that opens conversation. I strongly feel that that is the path forward in trying to address why abusive men in particular are able to just walk away kind of clean and say, well, hey, I did nothing wrong.
Or, it didn't work out. Some marriages don't work out. That's why I created this community, to be that safe place. Yeah. Because other places are like, oh, all guys use porn. Why are you so worried about it? So here at Betrayal Trauma Recovery, we are all about safety. Safety, 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 safety. We will help you figure out what is going on. And we recommend that while you don't know what's going on, that you get to safety quickly. And then from a safe place, you can objectively observe and find out what's happening. I get the impression that Susan didn't know about the pornography until the very end. Was there any indication that she knew about it early on?
I doubt that she did. I mean, like I mentioned, there's some speculation by some in law enforcement that maybe she discovered something and that was a catalyst. I'm under the impression that Susan had no clue Josh was viewing pornography.
I've always wondered why reporters don't include the alleged perpetrator's pornography use when they're reporting crime or murder. If it was a factor, I think that would really highlight how pornography is an element of domestic abuse.
And to the point about why do you not hear it reported, it's a difficult spot, especially early on in reporting. A lot of times we're working from a limited amount of information. The Powell case is very unique in that in putting together the Cold podcast, we had access to a lot of information that was not available to us when Susan first disappeared. Material that was gained through search warrants and subpoenas and things like that. So when I sat down to tell Susan's story, I was more informed than I think many of us were at the time that she disappeared about what was going on behind the scenes. Say somebody came forward and said, yeah, Josh goes on the internet and he looks at pornography. You need kind of a nexus that ties it together. And without all of the context of Josh's journals and Susan's journals and all the stuff with these recordings, it's very difficult to put that together in a way where you see the broader context. So I'm kind of grateful that with the rise of podcasting and some of this more long-form investigative, we're better able to make those associations clear than you will ever see on the 10 o'clock news. I think when you look at Josh as somebody who is leading a double life, to your other point, he very clearly was not ever going to allow Susan to see his true self. Josh was a narcissist. And I say that in the sense of a psychologist actually said you have narcissistic personality disorder. He created a persona, the persona of Josh as a young man And the older he grew, the more solidified that persona became. And the inner core, the true identity of Josh Powell, was not something that, because of that outer shell, anybody was ever going to touch, especially his wife. And so, yes, he is never going to concede to her that he's viewing pornography, that he's taking all of these steps that, in my opinion, were preparatory for killing her and cashing in on her life insurance. The exterior was all about, he's the expert at everything. Nobody is smarter than me. My kids are the best kids and can do no wrong because they're extensions of me. It's a very interesting thing, I think, with men who are abusive in this way, that they very similarly tend to show kind of some of these narcissistic traits where they have this secret life. They protect that secret life to the exclusion of everything else. And I think part of what creates this danger, right, is the idea that when you are exposed, when, say, a spouse discovers this, now this is going to collapse that entire world. Mm-hmm. And as a man who's exhibiting this kind of narcissism, when you face that reality of your world collapsing versus, I'll just make this person who discovered it, who sees the real me, go away. But I think that's part of why we see violence and especially homicide come into play in those moments.
Yeah, I think so too. I discovered my husband's porn use 18 months after we had married in the temple, and he had promised me over and over that he didn't use porn. And so he had been lying to me and manipulating me the whole time. I think it's really interesting that he went into recovery. And when I say that, I mean in quotes. He became like the model pornography addict in recovery. And we were actually speaking about his amazing recovery. And I didn't know that he was still lying and manipulating me. Mm-hmm. So near the end, I was like, this is a sham. You are a fake. You are not in recovery. You haven't been. And you're speaking to people as if you are. And that is when the violence escalated. Mm-hmm. I was like, I'm not speaking with you anymore. I quit my job. I was the PR director of a popular pornography addiction recovery practice. And so I quit my job and I was like, no, I am done in the pornography addiction recovery space, which you may or may not be very familiar with. When someone enters recovery, everything in that family becomes about him and his recovery. Let's make sure he's okay. Let's treat him like he has cancer. I believe that that's actually a continuation of the abuse. I think at that time they should say, okay, she's a victim of abuse here. She's been a victim of abuse for 10 years when she didn't know about his pornography use. Now we know. Let's treat her like she has cancer and let's make sure she's safe. And then let's wait at a safe distance to see if he really actually is a safe person to be around. That's not what happens right now. When a couple goes in to Clergy and says he's using pornography, they're like, oh, okay, well, wife, you support him.
Yeah.
Be supportive. And I'm like, what? No, that should never happen because you don't know what else is going on. Like, get her to safety. I mean, I can't tell you how many women are spending tons of time reading books about pornography addiction. How can I support him? How can I make sure I don't shame him? And on and on. And he's like, great. It's all about me. The relationship's all about me. Meanwhile, she can't live a life because the whole life is about him and his pornography addiction. They have to adjust everything to fit this new reality. And it's, as you can tell, really making me mad.
And so like Susan, right? With Susan and Josh, we see that when Susan is in therapy, Josh is unwilling to go. And Susan writes repeatedly that she hopes that if she goes and he sees that it improves her, that he will be then willing to go as well. I want to go back in time and sit down with Susan and say, Susan, you do not understand the way your husband's brain works because that is never going to happen. The only time he ever goes to therapy is when she confronts him with, I'm leaving. And Susan is the meal ticket. She is doing the childcare. She's doing the breadwinning. She's taking care of the house. If Susan leaves, Josh is going to have to work. And he's also going to have to explain why his wife left, right? So he reluctantly goes along, does the minimum necessary in that situation to just keep her on the hook. The idea of be supportive of your husband, you're working together, he's going to see how it improves me. He's like, Josh has no interest in improving. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of these men who are, again, psychologically abusing their spouses, who are violating that trust, they're not interested in self-improvement for self-improvement's sake.
When people say, well, he's going to therapy, I'm like, but why is he going to therapy? Is it because he really genuinely wants to change? From your podcast, we can see why it was difficult for the law to stop Josh Powell, who was under investigation for murder, because they were trying to gather evidence. So, what hope do victims like me and my community have of getting help when it's quote unquote just emotional abuse? What would you say to Susan before the murder? Let's say 5 years before.
Susan dealt with a lot, I think, of self-doubt. She knew something was wrong in her marriage. And she took some steps to begin the process of extricating herself from Josh and protecting herself. And in my opinion, is no one clear answer as to why she stayed in that relationship. Because I hear that a lot, right? Why did she stay? Which in my opinion is the wrong focus. The focus should be on why do we have an abusive man who's perpetrating on his wife. But for the sake of argument, if we take this question of why did Susan stay, a lot of people want to blame the church, people that maybe aren't from the community or even who are, who say, well, clearly she was deluded by her religion. You have other people who want to blame it on XYZ. Well, the truth is, I think in any of these situations, in any relationship like this, there are a lot of different influences. Susan feels some degree of fear because Josh has made, I think, some threats to her in probably some very subtle ways, right? She expresses a fear at one point of, hey, I'm riding my bike to work on 5600 West in West Valley City, this busy road, and how easy would it be for me to have an accident, air quotes, when her father-in-law is writing in his journal that Josh has mentioned, boy, he just sure wishes that Susan would get hit by a car. So I'm looking at that saying, yeah, he's probably told her as much, right? I wish you would just get hit by a truck. And she's thinking, oh my gosh, my husband wants me dead. So you have fear. Susan goes to the temple and she prays about it. And she has a feeling that she needs to stay. So you have all of these contrary forces, emotions. What I would tell Susan is, A, trust your gut. Clearly, you were concerned enough to feel a fear, and then you basically talked yourself out of it. Second, you have more support than you realize. Susan had a network of friends and family who we see after she disappears catalyze and become this amazing force to advocate for her and for her story. And they're still doing that now, 10 years later. That's to me amazing. And I don't think she recognized how strong her support network was. The other thing I would tell her is, Susan, if you leave, you're going to be okay. Because living with somebody who year after year undercuts you and robs you of your positive self-image, who makes you feel like dirt, like you're unlovable, makes the idea of going out into the world by yourself with your two children and trying to have to make a go of it seem very daunting. I have the benefit of looking at Susan from outside of that relationship and seeing somebody who is incredibly hardworking, who is bright, who loves her boys, who has plenty of admirers, who has a lot of friends, who makes friends easily, right? And even for somebody who doesn't have all of those things, it's scary to leave and to take that step. But it's also not as scary as you probably think it is once you are on the other side. Like Susan would have been okay as long as she was safe from Josh. So going back to your point, get to safety, do whatever it takes to get to safety, and then start rebuilding your life and you'll be okay. But seeing the impact that Susan's story has had opened my eyes in a big way. Even today, having this conversation with you, Anne, is a continuation of that process. It's a matter of learning and forcing the uncomfortable. And that's my biggest takeaway, honestly. I think from seeing that abusive relationship in very close detail is, at its core, it is a lack of empathy on Josh's part, not showing what I would consider a human care for another person's well-being.
Yeah. There's a lot that goes into this whole topic of like misogyny and believing in women and the Me Too movement, all of these other factors that came about after the Me Too movement happened, after Susan's disappearance.
And it's not political. Like, I think Me Too gets a little politicized and people start wanting to say, well, but not all guys. And it's like, no. Let's not do that. Let's not do that. Let's just focus on believing and showing empathy for people who are in bad situations who need help. Yeah. That's all.
Yeah. Your podcast was amazing. It was gripping. If you have not listened yet, it is called Cold. If you have not heard it, I would highly recommend it. It is excellent. Thank you so much for your time, Dave. We appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Anne.
If this podcast is helpful to you, please help us reach other women by following or subscribing and giving us a 5-star rating. Thank you for helping other women find us. If you've already purchased a copy of my book, Trauma Mama, Husband Drama, please circle back and give it a 5-star rating. A lot of women are searching for books about betrayal trauma on Amazon, and rating Trauma Mama will help them find this podcast, which is free to everyone. Your donations keep this podcast going. Go to our website, btr.org, scroll to the bottom, click on Support the BTR Podcast. And until next week, stay safe out there.